So it's already time to move to our second speaker of the day, who's already here preparing her own presentation. Um, Marta Faustino, we all know Marta, but for the sake of equality, I'll of course present her too. So Marta is an appointed research fellow at the IFIL Nova, at the Nova Institute of Philosophy, where she coordinated between 2018 and 2022 the Art of Living research group. Marta Faustino is currently leading as principal SPI, as principal investigator, the FCT-funded exploratory project, Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, Contemporary Approach. She's also the author of several articles and essays on Nietzsche, on Hadot, Foucault, and also the Hellenistic philosophers. And she's also co-editor of several collections, including the late Foucault, Ethical and Political Questions. So, Marta, whenever you're ready, I think the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thanks, Matteo. Is everything okay? Can people see my slides? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay, so the paper I'm going to present here today is a revised version of a talk I gave a couple of months ago at a workshop organized by Laura Macher at University of Verona. And I apologize to the ones who were there, including Matteo, Simone, Michael, for a possible repetition of some of my main arguments. In any case, I've significantly changed the structure of the paper and also tried to accommodate several fruitful criticisms or suggestions I got there. So I hope this is an improved version of that paper. Given the strict limitation of time, I will focus my presentation only on Hadot, even though in the longer paper I'm preparing for the handbook, I plan to include Foucault as well. In any case, this is really just a draft, so any criticism, suggestion, comment is very, very welcome and appreciated. So philosophy as a way of life is generally presented as a conception of philosophy with a deeply practical, performative, and self-transformative potential. More than that, it is also often contrasted to predominant models that define philosophy as a theoretical and abstract discipline with no necessary impact on the way people are and or lead their lives. Contrary to the notion of philosophy that tends to prevail in modern universities, PWL is thus not restricted to a set of theories, doctrines, and arguments expressed in monographs, articles, and book chapters. Rather, its primary aim is to have a practical impact and transformative effect in one's character and way of living. As Hadot often repeats throughout his work, its aim is to form rather than to inform. In his view, philosophy as a way of life is an invitation to each human being to transform himself, and shall thus be understood not as a theoretical construct, but as a method for training people to live and to look at the world in a new way. Hence, far from the purely abstract theoretical activity that characterizes modern era philosophy, ancient philosophy was, in one of Hadot's most famous formulations, a mode of existing in the world which had to be practiced at each instant, and the goal of which was to transform the whole of the individual's life. So this fundamental distinction between theory and practice, and Hadot's alleged privilege of the latter over the former, seems to be at the core of his conception of PWL. At the same time, Hadot's emphasis on the practical dimension of ancient philosophy to the apparent detriment of theory is one of the most polemic and controversial aspects of his account. In this presentation, I will first analyze some of the criticisms that have been made to Hadot's conception of PWL, focusing in particular on Cooper, Nussbaum, and Miranda Vilches, according to whom Hadot completely neglects, or at least devalues, the role of theory and rational discourse in PWL. In a second moment, I will address these criticisms from a Hadotian point of view, clarifying the complex relation between theory and practice in his account of PWL, and arguing that the primacy that Hadot ascribes to practice does not imply a neglect of its theoretical counterpart. Finally, I will illustrate Haddo's position in what regards the relationship between theory and practice through reference to the ancient description of philosophy as a techne, and discuss the contrast between Haddo and his critics through the particularly controversial case of the cynics. So let us start with the criticisms, which I shall discuss here only very briefly. As we all know, one of the major critics of Haddo's account of philosophy as a way of life is John Cooper. In his book, Pursuits of Wisdom, Six Ways of Life in Ancient Philosophy, Cooper acknowledges the influence of Haddo's work in his own interpretation of ancient philosophy, while at the same time taking his distance from fundamental traits of Haddo's account, which in his view completely neglect or omit the main distinguishing mark of ancient philosophy, and indeed of philosophy broadly conceived, namely the prominent role of logos, that is, of theory, discourse, and rational argumentation in it. In his words, what's that? Does this work? Okay. So fascinating and even inspiring though I found how those ideas, his understanding of ancient philosophy and of what way it could be a full and complete way of life for its adherents, seemed to me to omit virtually altogether the central and indispensable place in philosophy, in Greece and ever since, of rigorous analysis and reasoned argumentation. So in Cooper's competing interpretation of ancient philosophy, philosophy was for the ancients, as it arguably still is for us today, an exclusively theoretical and intellectual accomplishment where non-discursive or non-cognitive practices played no significant role. According to Cooper, certain ancient philosophies, and not the whole of ancient philosophy, as Hadot contends, could become ways of life for their adherents because, first, they offered a set of reasoned, coherent, plausible, and well-argued, all-inclusive proposals for understanding human nature and the best way of living a human life, and second, because one's full grasp of that knowledge was considered enough to guide one's life and translate itself into one's way of life. This was possible because, in Cooper's view, philosophy was pursued in antiquity as not just the best guide to life, but as both the intellectual basis and the motivating force for the best human life. As Cooper explains, given the motivational force belonging to reason, once those who pursue philosophy have perfected their power of reason by coming to possess a reasoned, articulated philosophical understanding of, among other things, everything of value in a human life, they will be moved simply by that knowledge toward living in such a way as to realize in their life that correct scheme of values. So to lead a philosophical way of life meant for Cooper to lead a life grounded in and guided by one's own philosophical understanding of that set of well-reasoned, well-argued, and well-grasped ideas about the world, the human being, and the best possible human life. It is this rational understanding and the capacity to live exclusively on its basis that distinguishes the philosophical way of life from other possible ways of living. According to Cooper, there are several typical philosophical exercises that might help strengthen that understanding and facilitate a philosophical way of life, such as studying, rational analysis, logical argumentation, demonstration and refutation of theories, critical reflection and dispute, and so on, but they all have a strictly cognitive or intellectual nature. Non-rational practices, as the one Hadot describes as spiritual exercises, not only did not have a place in the strictly philosophical way of life, but they would even be potential distractions and hence obstacles to the reasoned understanding of the truth and hence to the properly philosophical way of life. In deep contrast with Hadot's account, Cooper concludes, thus, that the ancients did not, after all, have a very different conception of philosophy than we still have today. As he says, for the ancients with whom I am concerned, exactly as with us, the essential core of philosophy is a certain, specifically and recognizably philosophical style of logical, reasoned argument and analysis. A similar claim can be found in Martha Nussbaum, who, in her Therapy of Desire, even though acknowledging the presence of practices of self-shaping in ancient philosophy, claims that they are common to religious and magical or superstitious movements. In this quote, she is referring particularly to Foucault, but obviously the criticism would apply to Hadot as well. So what really distinguishes philosophy from other disciplines or ways of living, Nussbaum argues, similarly to Cooper, is its commitment to reason and the truth, its engagement with, quote, valid and sound arguments, and its pursuit of logical validity and intellectual coherence, the only legitimate philosophical means to achieve a flourishing life. By emphasizing the practical dimension of ancient philosophy, omitting or neglecting the role of reason, theory, and rational argumentation, and defending the central role of spiritual exercises in it, Hadot ends up, in Cooper's and Nussbaum's views, blurring the lines between philosophy and religion and offering, in Cooper's words, a badly distorted account of what ancient philosophy was and of how, unlike most of philosophy over its long history since the end of antiquity, the ancient philosophies managed to be ways of life for their adherents. A more moderated version of this criticism is presented by Miranda Vilches in an article with the title The Place of Discourse in Philosophy as a Way of Life. Even though praising the way Hadot emphasized an important trait of ancient philosophy that significantly and rightly distinguishes it from contemporary philosophy, the importance of living a good life and the role of philosophy in enabling it, Vilches considers that Hadot overestimates that he overestimates the living component and does not sufficiently appreciate the vital role of theory in philosophy, ascribing to the latter only a secondary and hence minor role. Against Hadot, Miranda Vilches argues that despite the relevance of living philosophically for the ancients, philosophical knowledge and the indissociable pursuit of truth had an equally and perhaps primordially relevant role and status in the lives of philosophers. The priority of practice over theory is thus criticizable because, in his view, theory and practice enjoyed an at least equal significance in ancient philosophy. As he concludes, philosophy was essentially composed of theory and practice for the ancients. Living according to reason was important, but no more than rationally knowing the world and our place in it. So differently from Cooper and Nussbaum then, Miranda Vilches accuses Hadot not of completely neglecting the role of theory and rational discourse in his account of philosophy as a way of life, but simply of not recognizing the central and primary role they played in ancient philosophy. In any case, underlying all these criticisms is the idea that Hadot overemphasized the relevance of practice in ancient philosophy and failed to acknowledge the fundamental role of theory and discourse in it, thus distorting the image of ancient philosophy and even of philosophy more generally understood. Okay, so let us now turn to Hadot and see whether these criticisms apply to what he had in mind when he described ancient philosophy as a way of life, or when he proposed this model as an alternative to the way philosophy is conceived of today. Since there will be another talk on the controversial topic of spirituality, I will leave this important aspect aside and focus almost exclusively on the claim that Hadot has omitted, neglected, or at least devalued theory and rational discourse in his account of philosophy as a way of life. So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that some of Hadot's passages might indeed suggest his interpretation and hence justify these criticisms. In his effort to emphasize the practical dimension of ancient philosophy and the prevalence of spiritual exercises in it, Hadot might seem at times to downplay the role of reason, theory, and discourse and imply that ancient philosophy was basically, or even only, a spiritual practice where discourse played no significant role. In Philosophy as a Way of Life, for example, Hadot describes a philosophical life as equivalent to the practice of spiritual exercises, and very sharply claims that philosophy in antiquity was a spiritual exercise. Seen from this perspective of the practice of spiritual exercises, Hadot adds, philosophy then appears not as a theoretical construct, but as a method for training people to live and to look at the world in a new way. We find similar claims that intensify the opposition between theory and practice, emphasizing the presence and relevance of the latter to the detriment of the former in almost every work of Hadot. For as he explains in an interview with Arnold Davidson, his main preoccupation has been precisely to show that what was considered to be pure theory, abstraction, was actually practice in both its mode of exposition and its finality. Indeed, it is evident that Hadot would not agree with the meta-philosophy implied in Cooper's, Nussbaum's, and Wilshi's criticisms, according to which theory and rational discourse and argumentation are the primary aim or the most important component of philosophy in antiquity or ever. Hadot very explicitly claims that indeed practice, lived practice, was the end goal of ancient philosophy, discourse being a means to this end, and as such subordinated to practice. As he claims in Philosophy as a Way of Life, theory was never considered an end in itself, but rather clearly and decidedly put in the service of practice, or more concretely, of the philosophical life. In this sense and coherently, Hadot insists, uh, yeah, Hadot insists that philosophical discourse was only one element of philosophical activity and must be understood from the perspective of the way of life, which it is both the expression and the means. But does the fact that Hadot does not consider theory or discourse the end goal of ancient philosophy imply that they are completely neglected or even deemed less important or relevant than practice on his account of philosophy as a way of life? So even though Hadot was particularly concerned with emphasizing the practical dimension of ancient philosophy as a way to challenge dominant theoretical models, as exemplified by Cooper and Nussbaum, we find many passages in his work where he clearly addresses the concerns expressed above. In his introduction to What is Ancient Philosophy, for example, Hadot very directly underlines that that his emphasis on the practical and spiritual end goal of ancient philosophy does not involve a neglect of its theoretical counterpart, which he indeed ready acknowledges and even praises. As he clearly states, uh, yeah, sorry. As he clearly states, his aim has never been to deny the existence of a will to coherence or systematization amongst the ancient philosophers, which is evident, quote, in the considerable number of divisions, classifications, and hierarchical distinctions that we find in ancient philosophers, and which clearly reveals this ideal of systematization. What Hadot tries to do in his work is simply to contextualize this undoubtedly complex and fascinating theoretical elaboration in the context of ancient philosophy, which, in his view, and in contrast to Cooper's, was significantly different from our own. Obviously, there can be no question of denying the extraordinary ability of the ancient philosophers to develop theoretical reflection on the most subtle problems of the theory of knowledge, logic, or physics. This theoretical activity, however, must be situated within a perspective which is different from that which corresponds to the idea people usually have of philosophy. This different perspective that Hadot presents implies a subordination of this theoretical reflection to the choice of a particular way of life, which, according to Hadot, precedes and determines a given philosophical discourse. But philosophical discourse is, in turn, fundamental, as its task is to reveal and rationally justify this existential option, as well as the theoretical presuppositions and the vision of the world that it implies. Philosophical discourse is thus a crucial and integral part of the philosophical way of life, and there is a reciprocal relation of mutual dependency between theory and practice, such that, as Hadot explicitly claims, philosophy is or was in antiquity necessarily and indissolubly both theory and practice, discourse and way of life. In his words, philosophy is above all a way of life, but, and this but must be emphasized, one which is intimately linked to philosophical discourse. It is at the same time and indissolubly a discourse and a way of life which tend toward wisdom without ever achieving it. Aware of the misunderstanding that his emphasis on practice could generate, In an essay entitled Ancient Philosophy and Ethics or Practice, Hadot further clarifies that one must not conclude that philosophical discourse is not itself a crucial part of philosophy. On the contrary, Hadot emphasizes that philosophy is a way of life which brings with it integrally a certain mode of discourse, which in turn plays a vital role in the philosophical life. Consequently, they, philosophical discourse and the philosophical life, are incommensurable but also inseparable. There is no discourse which deserves to be called philosophical if it is separated from the philosophical life. And there is no philosophical life unless it is directly linked to philosophical discourse. More than that, in the mentioned essay, Hadot claims that there is a relation of dependency of the former on the latter, such that philosophy as a way of life not only needs, but even presupposes the existence of a highly systematic theoretical discourse. This highly systematic theoretical discourse must not be understood as a purely intellectual construction, conceived in independence of its practical consequences, as according to Hadot, its aim was precisely to bring together the different dogmas of the school and present them in the most concise and their articulated form so as to facilitate their memorization and application in each situation of the philosopher's life. The aim of theoretical and systematic discourse was thus, in Hadot's words, that of producing an effect upon the soul of their listener or reader. And this is why even theoretical discourses, systematic constructions, and, in general, written texts can, in Hadot's view, be considered spiritual exercises. Sorry. The same applies to those intellectual operations that Cooper and Nussbaum place at the heart of philosophy, such as dialectic, dispute, or logical analysis and rational argumentation. These are, these are exercises of reason that Hadot not only does not omit or neglect, but explicitly includes in his long list of spiritual exercises, even if he does not restrict them to these and does not rank them as highly as Cooper or Nussbaum do. They are spiritual in Hadot's understanding because their aim is to produce an effect of transformation upon the interlocutor. They are not enough because, in Hadot's understanding, sorry, the philosophical act is not situated merely on the cognitive level, and the transfiguration of perception that is intended involves not only the intellect but one's entire psychism and inner self. Hence the importance of other non-intellectual or non-cognitive practices that help creating new habits and transforming one's inner self and way of life accordingly. In this process of self-transformation and spiritual progress, however, discourse itself plays a crucial role, for, as Hadot points out, the philosopher who himself practices philosophy cannot act upon himself and others except through discourse. In another formulation, when we wish to teach philosophy and invite people to practice it, we are obliged to use discourse. And indeed, the philosophical way of life is nothing but internalization and assimilation of the theoretical discourse into one's own inner discourse, letting philosophical discourse go, as Hadot says, from exteriority to interiority. So this is why philosophy as a way of life is deeply dependent on and indeed presupposes a highly rigorous systematic theoretical discourse, even if it is not reduced to it and doesn't see it as its sole task or end goal. As Hadot emphasizes under influence of the Stoics, there is a fundamental difference between philosophy and philosophical discourse. While philosophical discourse contains complex and elaborated theories on logic, physics, and ethics, philosophy consists in living logic, physics, and ethics. In other words, when it comes to philosophy, the aim is not simply to elaborate, study, or discuss systems of logic, physics, and ethics, but to live according to that incorporated knowledge. As Hadot explains in that passage from philosophical discourse to philosophy, we no longer study logical theory, that is, the theory of speaking and thinking well, We simply think and speak well. We no longer engage in theory about the physical world, but we contemplate the cosmos. We no longer theorize about moral action, but we act in a correct and just way. Although thus rejects the common assumption that ancient philosophers offered ways of living because their ethics was more developed than the other parts of philosophy. Practice must not be reduced to the ethical part of philosophy because lived philosophy is not limited to the practice of moral duties, but also involves the control of the activity of thought and cosmic consciousness. Lived philosophy is thus a practice or a way of life which embraces all human activity. As a consequence, the frontier between theory and practice should not be situated between ethics and the other parts of philosophy, but rather within each part of philosophy, each of which containing a theoretical discourse and its practical application, including their own spiritual exercises to facilitate a transition from theory to lived practice. In sum, philosophy is a unitary activity that necessarily involves both theory and practice as equally relevant and mutually implicated components that cannot exist independently. Without practice, theory is just discourse about philosophy, not proper philosophy. But without theory, there is no practice either, as each school is founded on a certain philosophical discourse and justified by it, even if its original impulse is a non discursive choice for a certain mode of life. Both theory and practice, rational pursuit of the truth and way of life, are essential and intrinsic components of philosophy, such that, as Hadot himself concludes, philosophy always swings between these two poles, the discourse and the choice concerning a way of life. 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have tried to show that far from neglecting or minimizing the role of theory and rational discourse in ancient philosophy, Hadot even stresses their cardinal importance in several important passages of his work. I have argued that even though Hadot indeed ascribes a certain primacy to practice over theory, in the sense that the former is the end goal of ancient philosophy while the latter is a means to that end and as such subordinate to it, this in no way diminishes the relevance and role of theory and rational discourse in Hadot's account. On the contrary, theory and practice should be seen as equally important and mutually implicated components of what Hadot called philosophy as a way of life. In this last section, I would like to illuminate both Hadot's position and its contrast to Cooper's and Nussbaum's accounts through reference to the ancient description of philosophy as a techne and the particularly controversial case of cynicism, which could potentially also contradict the way I described Hadot's conception of PWL. In this respect, it is significant to note that neither Cooper nor Nussbaum include cynicism in their studies of ancient philosophy. For Cooper, cynicism was simply a popular offshoot of philosophy, not the philosophy of its own, that is, a life based on sustained philosophical analysis and argument. The lack of evidence connecting the cynic, extremic ascetic way of life to a set of philosophical views that might have supported it prevents Cooper from recognizing cynicism as a philosophical school, arguing that the movement belongs to social history rather than to the history of philosophy. Marta Nussbaum has a similar argument that I am going to jump because I don't have time. Now, despite the important contrast of Hadot's metaphilosophy with the one represented by Cooper and Nussbaum, if theory is considered a central component of philosophy as a way of life, and if, as Hadot claims, there is no philosophical life unless it is directly linked to philosophical discourse, then cynicism could emerge as a potential problem for Hadot as well. As we all know, however, that is not the case, and not only does Hadot consider it an instance of philosophy as a way of life, but even classifies it as a highly revelatory example of what he described as the nature of philosophy in the ancient world. The cynics are highly revelatory precisely because they are a limit case, as Hadot himself describes. The cynics had no scholastic organization or dogmas, did not argue and gave no instructions, were not engaged in any scholarly activity, and their philosophy was exclusively a choice of life, where philosophical discourse was reduced to a minimum. And yet, Hadot argues, cynicism was rightly considered a philosophy throughout the whole of antiquity. Now, does this imply a contradiction in Hadot's account? How can Hadot simultaneously value theory and rational discourse as a central component of PWL and consider cynicism a particular revelatory instance of it? Does the case of cynicism, after all, confirm the concerns of Hadot's critics regarding the overvaluation of practice to the detriment of theory or discourse in his account of PWL? I believe that reflecting on the nature of philosophy as an art or craft, techne, as it was conceived of in antiquity, helps us make sense of both Hadot's appreciation of cynicism and the primacy he ascribes to practice without this implying a neglect of its theoretical counterpart. Indeed, another way to put the relative primacy of practice over theory in Hadot's account of PWL is to claim that in consonance with the definition of philosophy as an art or craft, Hadot gives primacy and in some cases precedence to practical knowledge, the know-how, over theoretical or propositional knowledge, the know-that. Just like in the case of other arts or crafts such as music, carpentry, shoemaking, or cookery, also in philosophy conceived as an art of living, there is certainly an important theoretical knowledge involved, but what is truly decisive is the result, the capacity to bring that knowledge into practice, the ability to actually perform that art or craft, in the case of philosophy, to lead the most perfect and flourishing human life. Now, this is a claim that in principle neither Cooper nor Nussbaum would contest. However, for both authors, propositional knowledge is a necessary and sufficient condition for the successful performance of the craft. In order to live well, one must necessarily possess the theoretical knowledge of what it takes to live well, and that theoretical knowledge is sufficient for one to actually live well, provided that one has fully understood it and is convinced of its truth. Now, these are the premises that Hadot rejects, and it is easy to understand this rejection if we think again of other arts or crafts. Regarding the first premise, it is not difficult to think of someone who is able to make perfect shoes without ever having studied the theory of shoemaking, or of an excellent cook who cooks without knowing or even being able to give the recipe of what they have just cooked. They have learned exclusively by practice, experience, and example, and even though their end result implies or presupposes a certain theoretical knowledge that grounds their respective crafts, they might not be able to make it explicit, and they are no less shoemakers or cooks, respectively, than the ones who have learned on the basis of theory. So also with the cynics. Despite their meager theoretical apparatus, their very life bore meaning within itself and implied an entire doctrine, as Hadot explains. Even though they did not engage in rational argumentation or justify their way of life in philosophical treatises, their choice of life implied a certain conception of life, as well as their philosophical concepts, which instead of being discursively exposed or logically argued and proven, were rather very directly exposed to their attitudes and behavior, that is, their way of life. Conversely, and as to the second premise, we can also easily think of someone who has thoroughly studied the art of music and is unable to play, or at least play well, any instrument, or the case of an artist who knows everything about the history of art and its different techniques, but is unable to produce any valuable work of art. Similarly, one can be very well versed in Epicureanism or know by heart all the Stoic doctrines and dogmas and still be unable to convert that knowledge into practice and actually become an Epicurean or a Stoic. In this case, one could perhaps be a professor of philosophy but not a real philosopher, at least not in Hadot's sense of the word. Just as the real musician is the one who plays well and the real artist is the one who produces a work of art, so also in the case of philosophy, Hadot argues, a philosopher is the one who manages to lead a good life and not the one who speculates on the good life or presents elaborate arguments on how to do it. Just like any other art or craft, philosophy is something that demands not only knowledge of the craft, but also its correct practice or application. Given that in the specific case of the art of living, it is one's very life that is at stake, the correct practice of the craft will necessarily involve a work of ascesis, what Hadot calls spiritual exercises, that is, a constant and persistent work of the self on the self with a view to self-transformation until one is able to attain the perfect result of the craft, that is, the most perfect and flourishing human life. Again, this does not mean that theory is irrelevant or even less relevant than practice in Hadot's account of philosophy as a way of life. First, because any art or craft, in order to be an art or craft, must necessarily have a discourse that, as Hadot clarifies, justifies and grounds that specific art or craft, in the case of philosophy, a specific school of thought. As Hadot emphasizes, philosophy as a way of life implies or presupposes a strong theoretical background, even if it is not always or not necessarily made explicit, as in the case of the Cynics. And second, because just like any art or craft, philosophy is something that admits progress and different stages of mastery of the art. As such, while one might consider stages of learning of the art where either theory or practice are still underdeveloped, and in particular a stage where one is already able to lead a philosophical life without having full knowledge of the theoretical background behind it, an excellent philosopher will be the one who masters equally both theory and practice, that is, both the doctrine and the respective way of life. In sum, and I'm finishing, sorry, finishing, what Hadot stresses and illuminates in contrast to Cooper or Nussbaum is not that philosophy was, is, or should be practice instead of theory, but rather, and simply, that this theory, important as it is neither the end goal, nor the core, nor even necessarily the starting point of philosophy. In Hadot's view, not only is there no causal relation between theory and practice, in the sense that the possession of theoretical knowledge would necessarily yield a good practical result, but the order might even be the reverse, as implied in the idea that theory and practice reciprocally influence and determine each other. Consequently, theoretical speculation, rigorous analysis, and rational argumentation are important philosophical tools, but first, they are only some among many other possible philosophical or spiritual exercises, and second, they are necessarily secondary, instrumental, and subordinate to the true end goal of philosophy, which is not simply to master a certain knowledge in abstraction, but to translate that knowledge into one's way of life. In Hadot's short formulation, and I end here, philosophy is, above all, a mode of life which includes a certain mode of discourse as one of its integral parts without being reduced to it. Thank you. I'm sorry. Sorry, the organizers, for not respecting the time.
All right, thank you, Marta, for the paper. I think we can have some time for Q&A. Yeah, that's all right. If you have any questions there, we have one. John, let's gather those questions. If there's anyone from home, Michael again, right? And then Michael, please.
Okay. Hi, Marta. Thanks for that talk. So I have 2 points I want to get your thoughts on. One is just whether there's a common assumption here that should maybe be questioned, that there's uh, a unified relationship between theory and practice that you see in all these ancient schools, or that you also need in contemporary philosophy. You might think that for the Epicureans, the theoretical is all for the sake of the practical, but that might not be right for Aristotle or Plotinus. So do they all need to be operating on the same model, or using this techne analogy in the same way? And to kind of follow up on that, it seems the other, I think, maybe mistake is making here is equating theory with abstraction and discourse, and this kind of back and forth between philosophy professors the way that we do now, when we look at what someone like Aristotle or Plotinus thinks the goal of life is. It is theorein or theoria, and not in this abstract sense, but in the sense of contemplating the cosmos that certainly Hadot did emphasize, but that is not practical or ethical in a certain sense, and it's not just more logical argumentation, but it is a kind of seeing where the seeing itself isn't something distinct from and following from the theory as a distinct practice. Instead, it's all one thing. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Marta. That was very interesting. I've got lots of comments. Maybe I'll write them down for you or something. Just one very quick comment now. So when you were talking about Techne as a model, and you talked about the way in which someone might effectively learn an art or craft just through practice without any reference to theory whatsoever. I was reminded of the discussions we find in the early Platonic dialogues where Socrates is drawing a distinction between, he's talking about rhetoric and he's talking about techne, and he's saying, well, what we want something is more than simply a knack, more than something that people have really sort of picked up by chance and through practice. And by thinking of this in terms of a techne that presumably involves some considered knowledge of the underlying principles, we're going to be in a much stronger position because, if things go wrong, we're going to know why they've gone wrong. And so that would be one reason why we might say the kind of knowledge of the theoretical underpinnings could be important rather than just focusing on something that's learned just through practice. So anyway, just a thought.
And then we also have a question from home, Michael.
Hi, thanks. That was very interesting. I kind of think it's a follow-up on the two questions. I, I I wonder what you think that it's not just the theory practice distinction, and in particular the theoretical nature of discourse as um um and the power of reason and the autonomy of reason. It's very much also the orientation of theory to the natural world, the cosmos, the source of epistemic authority and of truth being the natural world rather than cultural, legal, symbolic, narrative world, historical world. That seems to me really crucial in the philosophical attitude as a way of distinguishing it from other forms of life. And it seems to me then that the place of nature as the source of physics, as the source of truth and epistemic authority, that seems to me, I think, the decisive point, which is why which is okay, more to say.
That was more a comment than a question, right? And I thank you for that.
I'm wondering what you think about that, because I found that your discussion on theory and practice really highlighted the differences of opinion there, and I could see how what you were saying, but I didn't hear I didn't hear. I wonder if you think that the theory has to be also oriented towards the natural world. It can't just be about, because there's lots of reason and dialectics and things like that going on in religious traditions, in textual traditions, and so forth. But the orientation to the natural world seems to me the distinguishing feature. I just wondered what you think about that.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I don't have time to properly reply any of the questions, but they are all very interesting. Thank you. I will just very briefly comment on each of them. Um, Caleb, I think I'm not completely sure if I should use this model of the understanding what Hadot might have meant with philosophy as a way of life through the model of philosophy as an art of living. I know that they are, as Annie has very well shown, they are not precisely the same. They mean different things. I just thought this was also following the discussion I had in Verona with many of the colleagues about the first version of the paper. I realized that when we try to understand this relation of theory and practice, and most of all, mainly the idea that practice has a certain primacy over theory without implying a neglect of theory, nevertheless, I think this metaphor of the art or craft or specific metaphors really help us understand the specific relation that is at stake here. when I was now finishing this paper, I thought, well, I cannot end my handbook chapter like this, because many, of course, especially if we think of other configurations of philosophy as a way of life after antiquity, obviously the model of the art of living or philosophy as a craft does not work. And that's not what I'm implying. I do not mean to say that all philosophies that can be considered ways of life need to follow this model. What I think is that this model helps us understand what Hadot had in mind when he described the complex relations between theory and practice. But of course, it probably does not apply to Aristotle, nor Augustinus, nor certainly to Descartes or the Nietzsche. This is really not what I meant, like to provide a kind of metaphilosophical work where we can decide if a philosophy is a way of life or not, if there is this kind of structure between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. But I think it does help us understand what Hadot had in mind when he said that there is this primacy of practice over theory, there is no philosophy, there is no practice, and yet this does not mean that theory is not important. Okay, also what you said about the example of Aristotle, of course, identifying theory with discourse in an abstract sense or in an argumentative sense. Of course, there can be other ways of understanding theory, like the life of contemplation. Here, I was particularly concerned in discussing the criticisms that have been made to Hadot by Cooper and Nussbaum, and those are that's the way they define theory, or those are the aspects that they emphasize, the lack of importance given to theory, discourse, and all the intellectual operations like rational argumentation, rigorous analysis, and so on. But in that regard, considering Aristotle, it could be argued that what you are defining as theory is actually practice. That's Hadot's claim, right? That even the life of contemplation, even the Aristotelian way of life, the life of contemplation, is actually a practical way of life, as John Sellers has actually very beautifully shown in an essay contained in that book, in that Briel's book. Now, regarding your question, John, I would love to discuss this at length with you, because you are the great expert of philosophy as the art of living, or the technical conception of philosophy. I'm sure there are many nuances I didn't take into account here. I'm not sure what to answer directly to what you replied. I understand the reference to the Socratic, to the Platonic dialogue. It's that even this practice when we think the practical performance of the craft, it is always better to think that there is also knowledge of the theoretical principles. That might be true. I'm just saying that it's probably not always so, or not necessarily so. We and here I'm not discussing Plato or Hadot. I'm just trying to think, what is a craft? What is the nature of a craft? And we know the example of a cook is a great example, right? That like the person who cooks perfectly and has no idea. You ask, can you give me the recipe? I would like to do it at home. And the person says, I have no idea. I just do it. Or yeah, the case of a carpenter, for example, who might not have studied the theory behind the house building or the shoemaker, and yet they can do it. Of course, the principles, that's what I tried to imply. The principles are presupposed. It's not that they are doing something arbitrarily. They are doing it rightly. They just don't know how to explain it. They just can't make explicit that knowledge they are applying. But that knowledge is there. I don't know if this makes sense to you or not, but there are actually crafts that are done and learned by practice and example and experience. And remembering a long conversation I had with Matteo, we can even think that the very beginning of a craft is not theoretical, as I think he will expose. I was giving the example of the carpenter, and that's the conversation we had in Verona. Um, okay, the carpenter, at some point there is a whole theory on how to build houses. But the first carpenter just needed to try. The first person who ever built a house just needed a house. And somebody tried to build a house and failed. And then came another person and did it better. And then at some point a theory started growing on how to build houses on the basis of experience and trial and error. But in this context, and in the context I'm not sure of any, we can't say, like, probably can't say that about medicine, but in many crafts you can say that you learn by practice and then you develop a theory on the basis of that practice. And I think it's very difficult to find a very rigid structure on which one comes first or which one is more relevant. Okay, but I'm happy that we can keep discussing this. As to Michael's question, and I see we don't really have time, right? Well, for the ancients, theory was composed of this tripartite. In this tripartite way, there was this tripartite division, right? There is logics, physics, and ethics. The knowledge of nature is certainly fundamental in physics, but I don't know if I would give it. I would have to think more about it. If you mean that theory, that nature needs to be the sole authority of theory, I don't think so. I think it's just a part of theory. But as Ado says, philosophy is a unitary act that involves the practice of both logics, physics, and ethics. Uh, so, wouldn't say not only nature, it's just a part of it. Okay, and sorry for taking so much time. And thank you for the questions. And I think there is a coffee break outside. I hope there is.